A billionaire doesn't cry over money. Marcus Whitmore had lost millions in bad deals and never flinched. But on a cold November evening in Newark, he was about to break down over a waitress's resemblance to a ghost. The fluorescent lights of Rosie's diner buzzed overhead like trapped insects, casting their harsh glow on peeling wallpaper and vinyl booths that had seen better decades. The air hung thick with the smell of burnt coffee, grease from the fryer, and the faint tang of bleach that never quite masked the wear of 30 years in business. For Meredith Clark, this wasn't just a workplace. It was survival. She moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned early that standing still meant getting left behind. At 28, she perfected the art of being invisible, refilling coffee before it was requested, clearing plates before the last bite was swallowed, existing in the background of other people's lives. Her apron bore the stains of a 12-hour shift, and her feet ached in shoes held together more by hope than leather. But the tips kept her studio apartment paid, kept the lights on, kept her moving forward even when forward felt like running in place. She'd grown up in the foster system, bouncing between homes that never quite felt like home. No parents to call, no family photos to hang on walls, no stories about where she came from or who she was supposed to be. Just Meredith Clark, a name assigned by a social worker who couldn't be bothered to get creative. Table 7 had been different all evening. The man sitting alone in the corner booth radiated wealth in a way that made him stand out like a diamond in a drawer of broken glass. His suit probably cost more than she'd earned in 6 months. His hands, when he lifted his coffee cup, trembled slightly, not from age or weakness, but from something deeper, something that looked like barely contained emotion. Meredith had served him twice already, and he'd barely looked at her. But when she bent down to pick up a fallen napkin near his table, her fingers brushed against something else on the floor, a torn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. She had no idea the torn photograph beneath table 7 would rewrite her entire existence. The photograph felt fragile between Meredith's fingers, like it might crumble into dust if she gripped too hard. She lifted it closer to examine what someone had carelessly dropped, and her breath caught in her throat. A young woman stared back at her from the faded image, or rather half of a young woman. The photograph had been torn vertically down the middle, leaving only the left side of the face visible. But that half was enough, more than enough. Those eyes, that smile, the small, distinctive birthmark just above the left eyebrow. Meredith had seen that face every single morning in her bathroom mirror for 28 years. Her hand began to shake. The resemblance wasn't close, it was exact. Uncanny. Impossible. The woman in the photograph looked older, maybe in her mid-20s, and the image itself had the washed-out quality of something taken decades ago. The clothing was vintage, the hair styled in a way that screamed early 90s. But the face could have been Meredith's twin. Her mind raced through explanations that made no sense. A relative she'd never known about? But foster kids didn't usually have photo albums waiting for them. A coincidence? The birthmark alone killed that theory. Where did you get that? The voice behind her was sharp, urgent, stripped of the composure that wealth usually provided. Meredith spun around so fast she nearly dropped the photograph. Marcus Whitmore stood barely 3 feet away, and the transformation was startling. The calm, detached businessman who'd sat nursing coffee for the past hour had vanished. In his place stood a man whose carefully constructed walls had just shattered. His face had gone pale, his eyes stormy gray, and suddenly vulnerable, locked onto the photograph in her hand with an intensity that made her take a step back. "I asked you a question." His voice cracked slightly. "Where did you get that photograph?" Meredith's throat felt tight. "I found it under your table. It was just lying there on the floor." Marcus moved closer, and she noticed his hands were trembling worse than before. Not from age, from emotion so powerful it seemed to vibrate through him like an earthquake looking for release. "May I see it? Please." The please sounded like it cost him something. Meredith hesitated, then held out the photograph. The moment Marcus's fingers touched it, something in his expression broke completely. He stared at the image like a man seeing water after years in the desert. His thumb traced the torn edge with a gentleness that seemed out of place on a man wearing cufflinks worth more than her car. 32 years, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I've carried the other half for 32 years. Meredith's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't understand. Who is she? Marcus looked up from a photograph, and when his eyes met hers, she watched his face go through another transformation. Confusion, then recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to hope mixed with terror. He studied her face with the same intensity he'd given the photograph. His gaze moved from her eyes to her cheekbone to the birthmark above her left eyebrow. The color drained from his face even further. How old are you? The question came out barely above a whisper. 28. Why does that? When's your birthday? April 15th. But I don't see what. Marcus took a step back, and for a moment, Meredith thought he might collapse. He gripped the edge of a table for support, his knuckles going white. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse, raw with decades of buried pain. That photograph has been missing for 32 years. The woman in it, he paused, swallowing hard. The woman in it was my wife, Catherine. The diner seemed to tilt slightly. Meredith grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. Your wife. And you, young lady. Marcus's voice broke completely now. You are either the cruelest coincidence I've ever encountered, or the answer to a question I stopped asking a lifetime ago. Before Meredith could respond, before she could process what he was implying, the diner's front door chimed. A black Mercedes had pulled up outside, sleek and predatory in the yellow streetlight, and the woman who stepped out, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in a coat that probably cost more than Meredith earned in a year, made Marcus turn pale. Victoria Whitmore entered Rosie's diner like a queen inspecting a condemned building. Everything about her screamed old money and older grudges, from the precise cut of her steel-gray hair to the way her heels clicked against the linoleum with military precision. She was perhaps 60, but carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd never allowed themselves to slouch, not even once. Her eyes scanned the diner with barely concealed distaste, then locked onto Marcus, then onto Meredith, then onto the photograph still clutched in Marcus's hand. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus. Victoria's voice could have cut glass. What exactly is happening here? Marcus straightened, slipping the photograph into his jacket pocket with a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Victoria, I didn't call you. Your assistant did, when you disappeared for 3 hours without explanation. Her gaze shifted to Meredith, cold and evaluating. And who might you be? Meredith found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. I'm just a waitress. I work here. Just a waitress. Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She moved closer, studying Meredith's face with the clinical precision of a jeweler examining a suspected fake. When her eyes landed on the birthmark above Meredith's eyebrow, something flickered across her expression. Recognition and fury. She turned back to Marcus. You've got to be kidding me. Another one? Victoria, this is different. Different. Victoria's voice rose sharp enough to make the cook peek out from the kitchen. It's never different, Marcus. My brother has been searching for his daughter for 3 decades. And charlatans like you, she pointed at Meredith with a manicured finger, appear every few years like clockwork, usually right after Forbes publishes his net worth. The words hit Meredith like a physical blow. I didn't. Save it. Victoria pulled out her phone, already scrolling through contacts. I've heard every sob story. The convenient amnesia. The foster care background with no records. The remarkable resemblance. Let me guess. You just happened to find something that belonged to him. Meredith's face burned. Around them, the handful of other diners had stopped pretending not to listen. Marcus stepped between them, his voice firm. Victoria, that's enough. She didn't approach me. She found something I dropped. And when I saw her face, when you saw her face, you saw what you wanted to see for 32 years. Victoria's expression softened slightly when she looked at her brother, but the steel remained. I know you miss Catherine. I know you never stopped looking for Emma. But this, she gestured at Meredith, is exactly how it always happens. Someone who looks vaguely similar, a convenient story, and your hope does the rest. She has the birthmark. Marcus's voice was quiet but insistent. In exactly the same place. And her age. Thousands of people have birthmarks. Hundreds were born the same year as Emma. Victoria turned back to Meredith, and her voice took on a tone of practiced authority. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to agree to a DNA test, administered by our family physician, witnessed by our attorney. And when it comes back negative, you're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. Or, she paused, letting the word hang, I'll have my lawyers bury you in litigation so deep you'll be paying it off for the rest of your life. Meredith's hands clenched into fists. Every instinct screamed at her to tell this woman where to shove her DNA test and her threats. But another part of her, the part that had spent 28 years wondering who she really was, whispered something different. What if? Fine. The word came out steadier than she felt. I'll take your DNA test, because I'm not lying and I'm not a charlatan. I don't even know what's happening here. But if there's even a chance, her voice caught, if there's any chance this photograph means I came from somewhere, from someone, then I want to know. Victoria's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise, quickly masked. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., I'll send car. She turned and walked out as imperiously as she'd entered, leaving Marcus and Meredith standing in the harsh fluorescent light of Rosie's diner, surrounded by cold coffee and unanswered questions. What Meredith didn't know was that this photograph had already destroyed one family, and it was about to tear apart another. The black Mercedes arrived at Meredith's apartment building at 8:45 the next morning, 15 minutes early. The driver didn't speak, didn't even look at her as she climbed into the back seat. The leather smelled expensive, and the silence felt deliberately intimidating. Alpine, New Jersey sat tucked into the hills overlooking the Hudson River, where mansions hid behind stone walls and iron gates. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 5 acres of manicured lawns and gardens that probably required a full-time staff. The mansion itself looked like something transplanted from a European postcard. All stone and tall windows and architectural details that screamed generational wealth. Meredith felt her stomach twist as the car pulled through the gates. She'd agreed to this. Curiosity had won over pride, over common sense, over every instinct that said people like her didn't belong in places like this. But the photograph haunted her. The woman's face, her face, had filled her dreams. And the questions Marcus had asked kept circling through her mind like vultures. Your birthday, your age, the birthmark. What if she really did come from somewhere? From someone? Victoria met her at the front door with a physician in tow, Dr. Ramesh, who collected the DNA sample with professional efficiency and zero warmth. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. A cheek swab, a vial of blood, signatures on forms Meredith barely read. 3 days, Victoria said, as if pronouncing a sentence. The results will be conclusive. But it was Marcus who surprised her. After Victoria disappeared into some wing of the massive house, he approached Meredith with something almost apologetic in his expression. Would you like some coffee? Real coffee, not the burned stuff from Rosie's. She followed him through rooms that felt more like museum exhibits than living spaces. Crown molding, oil paintings and gilt frames, furniture that looked too pristine to actually sit on. The wealth didn't just whisper, it shouted. And it made her acutely aware of her thrift store jacket and worn sneakers. The kitchen was warmer, at least, marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, but also the smell of something baking and a woman humming quietly near the stove. Mrs. Chin, this is Meredith Clark. Marcus's voice had a gentleness when he addressed the housekeeper. Could you bring us coffee in the study? Mrs. Chin turned, and Meredith found herself meeting eyes that seemed to see far too much. The woman was perhaps 65, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun. Something flickered across her face when she looked at Meredith. Recognition, maybe, or shock. But it vanished quickly behind a professional smile. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Her voice carried the faint trace of an accent. Right away. The study was lined with books and smelled of leather and old paper. Marcus gestured to a chair near the fireplace, and for a moment, they sat in awkward silence. Then he pulled the torn photograph from his wallet, the other half that Meredith had found. Her name was Catherine, he began, his voice soft with memory. We met in college. She was studying art history, and I was convinced I was going to change the world through technology. A sad smile crossed his face. She changed my world instead. Meredith listened as he talked, painting a picture of a marriage that sounded almost too perfect. Catherine's laugh, her passion for obscure Renaissance painters, the way she danced in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. When Emma was born, his voice caught on the name. When our daughter was born in April of 1993, Catherine said it was the happiest day of her life. We took this photograph in the hospital right after. She insisted we each keep half, like those friendship necklaces teenagers wear. Said it meant we'd always find our way back to each other. He stared at the torn edge of his half, worn smooth from decades of handling. 3 months later, she was gone, vanished, took Emma and disappeared without a word, without a note, without any explanation. I spent everything I had trying to find them, hired investigators, offered rewards, chased every lead for years. The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed despite the decades. Eventually, people told me to accept that she'd left, that maybe she'd found someone else, wanted a different life. But Catherine wasn't like that. Something happened. Something made her run. Before Meredith could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. A man in his early 30s entered, tall, expensively dressed, with features that resembled Victoria's sharp edges. His eyes landed on Meredith with immediate hostility. "So this is the latest gold digger?" His voice dripped with contempt. "Brandon." Marcus's tone hardened. "Show some respect." "Respect?" Brandon laughed, cold and humorless. "Uncle Marcus, this is the 4th one in 5 years. Remember the woman from Boston? The one from Miami? They all had convenient stories and desperate circumstances. This one probably Googled you and practiced looking shocked in the mirror." "That's enough." Victoria's son ignored him, stepping closer to Meredith. "Let me guess, foster care, no family. Rough childhood? It's always the same script. Well, the DNA test will expose you like it did the others, and then you'll crawl back to whatever hole you came from." Mrs. Chin appeared with the coffee tray, and the tension in the room felt thick enough to choke on. Brandon left with a final contemptuous glance, and Marcus apologized with tired eyes that had clearly fought this battle before. The DNA results would take 3 days, but someone in that house couldn't wait that long. Meredith spent that first night back in her cramped studio apartment, pulling out every document she'd ever received from the state. Birth certificate, or rather, the amended one issued when no parents came forward. Foster care records with gaps wide enough to drive a truck through. Medical records that started when she was approximately 6 months old, with no history before that. The birth certificate listed her birthday as April 15th, 1997. But there was a notation in small print. Date of birth estimated based on medical assessment. Estimated, not confirmed, not recorded by a parent in a hospital. She'd never thought much about it before. Foster kids learned early not to ask too many questions about where they came from. The answers were usually disappointing or non-existent. But now, with Marcus's words echoing in her head, Emma was born in April of 1993. The gaps felt like canyons. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness as she searched through public records databases. Most required money she didn't have, but a few free options existed for basic searches. She typed in variations of her own name, her approximate birth date, Philadelphia hospital records. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Then, buried in a forum for people searching for biological relatives, she found a thread about Philadelphia's abandoned infant cases from the 90s. Someone had compiled a list from old newspaper archives, and there, dated July 1993, was an article that made her blood run cold. Infant found at St. Mary's Hospital, approximately 3 months old, female. No identification. Authorities seeking information. 3 months old in July meant born in April. The hospital was in Philadelphia, 2 hours from Newark. The timeline matched perfectly. Subscribe now, before the next piece falls into place and changes everything you thought you knew. Meredith's hands shook as she screenshot the article. The next morning, she returned to the Whitmore estate. Mrs. Chin answered the door this time, and something in her expression had shifted. Less guarded, almost sympathetic. "Mr. Whitmore is in meetings all morning," the housekeeper said quietly. "But perhaps you'd like some tea while you wait?" They sat in the kitchen, and Mrs. Chun poured tea with hands that seemed steadier than her voice. "How long have you worked here?" Meredith asked, trying to fill the awkward silence. 28 years. I was hired just months before. She paused, catching herself. Before Mrs. Catherine disappeared. The air between them felt charged with unspoken things. Mrs. Chin studied Meredith's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You look like her, the housekeeper finally whispered. So much like her, it breaks my heart. Before Meredith could respond, Mrs. Chin rose abruptly and left the kitchen. She returned moments later with something clutched in her hand, something small that glinted gold in the morning light. I found this, she said, pressing a locket into Meredith's palm. While cleaning the attic last week. It must have fallen behind some boxes years ago. I meant to give it to Mr. Whitmore, but her eyes met Meredith's with meaning. I think perhaps you should see it first. The locket was delicate, feminine, tarnished with age. Meredith's fingers fumbled with a tiny clasp. It took 3 tries to get open. Inside, on one side, were engraved initials, CW. On the other side, pressed flat and carefully preserved, was a hospital bracelet. The paper had yellowed, but the printed text was still legible. Baby girl. St. Mary's Hospital, Philadelphia, July 18, 1993. The room tilted. Meredith gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. Where exactly did you find this? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Chen's eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. In a box of Mrs. Catherine's things. Things Mr. Whitmore couldn't bear to look at. So they've been stored away all these years. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to almost nothing. That woman loved her daughter more than life itself. Whatever happened, whatever reason she had for leaving, it was to protect that baby. I knew her, and I know she would never have abandoned her child unless she had no other choice. Meredith's mind raced. The initials matched Catherine Whitmore. The hospital matched the newspaper article. The date matched when a 3-month-old would have been found if she'd been born in April. She found Marcus an hour later, showed him the locket with trembling hands, watched his face transform as he recognized it, as he read the hospital bracelet, as decades of questions seemed to crystallize into one impossible answer. But his reaction wasn't relief. It wasn't joy or vindication or hope. It was fear, raw, undiluted fear that made him grab her arm with surprising strength. Where did you get this? Who gave this to you? Mrs. Chin found it in. You need to leave. His voice was urgent now, almost panicked. Right now. Before. But when Meredith showed Marcus the locket, his reaction wasn't relief. It was fear. Marcus's fear infected the air like smoke. He pulled Meredith into his study, closed the door, checked the hallway twice before speaking in a voice tight with controlled panic. This locket, Catherine was wearing it the day she left. I remember because I'd given it to her for our anniversary. His hands shook as he examined the hospital bracelet. If it's been in this house all these years, that means... He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The implication hung between them like a noose. That meant Catherine had been here, had hidden evidence, had left breadcrumbs for someone to eventually find. A sharp knock interrupted them. Brandon entered without waiting for permission. His expression, a mixture of arrogance and barely contained anger. His eyes immediately found the locket in Marcus's hand. More fabricated evidence? His tone was mocking, but something else lurked beneath it. Something that looked like genuine concern. Uncle Marcus, you're being manipulated. Again. Brandon, not now. Actual Uncle Marcus, I need to speak with your guest privately. Brandon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just a quick conversation. Family business. Marcus looked like he wanted to refuse, but his phone buzzed with what must have been an urgent message. He gave Meredith an apologetic glance and stepped out, leaving her alone with Victoria's son. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Brandon moved to the door, locked it with a quiet click, then turned to face her with an expression that had lost all pretense of civility. Let's cut through the performance, he said flatly. I know what you are. I know what you want, and I'm here to offer you a solution that benefits everyone. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, tossed it onto the desk between them. It landed with the heavy thud of substantial contents. $500,000. Cash. Wire transfer to any account you specify. Or physical payment if you prefer to stay off the radar. His voice was pure business now. In exchange, you take your DNA sample and disappear. Tell Marcus the test made you uncomfortable, that you've reconsidered. Whatever story you want. Just vanish. Meredith stared at the envelope like it might bite her. $500,000. More money than she'd see in a decade of waitressing. Enough to change everything about her life. Go to school. Move somewhere better. Stop living paycheck to paycheck. I'm not here for money, she heard herself say. Brandon laughed cold and sharp. They all say that, right before they name their price. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Let me explain something about family dynamics. My mother worked for decades to build her position in this company. I've spent my entire life preparing to inherit what's rightfully ours. And then you, some random waitress with a convenient story, show up and threaten to derail 30 years of planning. I didn't ask for any of this. But you're here, and that's enough. His expression hardened. The DNA test will take 3 days. I'm offering you a way out before those results come back and make things complicated. Because here's what you don't understand. Even if by some miracle you are related to my uncle, you're not family. You didn't grow up in this house. You don't know our business, our world, our rules. You're an outsider who would destroy everything we've built. Meredith stood, anger finally overriding intimidation. The answer is no. I'm not taking your money. I'm seeing this through. Something dangerous flickered in Brandon's eyes. That's a mistake, a serious one. He picked up the envelope, tucked it back into his jacket. Don't say I didn't offer you the easy way. He unlocked the door and left, and Meredith realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from fury at being treated like a commodity, like a problem to be paid off and dismissed. The next 2 days crawled by with excruciating slowness. Meredith stayed in her apartment, jumped at every unexpected sound, and tried to ignore the feeling that she was being watched. Victoria's private investigator had apparently been thorough. Meredith received a call from her landlord asking about some concerns raised about your background. Her former foster parents received visits. Even the manager at Rosie's Diner got questions about her employment history. They were building a case, preparing to discredit her before the DNA results even arrived. Marcus called on the second evening, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something else. Regret, maybe. Or guilt. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Something I should have mentioned from the beginning. Catherine didn't just leave. She was running from someone. The story came out in fragments, like he was assembling a puzzle he'd tried for years to ignore. His former business partner, Gerald Ashford, a brilliant man who'd helped build Whitmore Industries from nothing, but also a man with connections to people who operated outside the law. When Marcus had discovered irregularities in the company finances, millions being siphoned through shell corporations, Ashford had made threats, explicit threats, against Catherine, against baby Emma. I thought I could handle it quietly. Marcus's voice cracked with old pain. Thought I could remove him from the company, recover the money, make it all go away without anyone getting hurt. But Catherine was terrified. She said she'd overheard phone conversations, seen documents that proved Ashford wasn't just stealing. He was laundering money for dangerous people, people who killed to protect their interests. Meredith's blood ran cold. What are you saying? I'm saying Catherine took Emma and ran because she believed it was the only way to keep our daughter safe. And if you really are Emma, his voice dropped to barely a whisper, then everything she sacrificed, everything she gave up to protect you, could be undone. Because whoever wanted us dead 32 years ago, they're still out there. The line went quiet for a long moment. The DNA results arrive tomorrow, Marcus finally said. And Meredith, I need you to understand something. I hope you're my daughter. God, I hope it more than I've hoped for anything in 3 decades. But I'm also terrified of what it means if you are. Then the DNA results arrived, and they proved what no one expected. The envelope arrived at 9:30 in the morning on day 3, delivered by courier to Marcus's study. Dr. Ramesh had sent the results directly, sealed and certified, with the laboratory's official stamp pressed into red wax like something from another century. Marcus called Meredith immediately. His voice was shaking so badly she could barely understand him. Can you come to the estate? Now, please. She arrived 20 minutes later, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Marcus met her at the door himself, not the butler, not Mrs. Chen, but Marcus. His eyes red-rimmed and bright with tears, he wasn't bothering to hide. He held the paper in trembling hands. 99.7% probability. His voice broke completely. You're my daughter. You're Emma. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Meredith grabbed the doorframe for support as Marcus pulled her into an embrace that felt like 32 years of grief finally finding release. He held her like she might disappear if he let go. And she found herself crying too, for the mother she'd never known, for the father she'd just found, for the identity she'd spent a lifetime missing. I looked for you, Marcus whispered against her hair. Every single day. I never stopped. And you were out there alone and I couldn't find you and I'm so sorry. You didn't know, Meredith managed through tears. You couldn't have known. Victoria appeared in the hallway, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. But the DNA results were indisputable, backed by a laboratory with an impeccable reputation. She couldn't argue with science, couldn't dismiss it as coincidence or fraud. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the paper Marcus showed her. I want independent verification, she said coldly. A second test from a different facility. We can do that, Marcus agreed, his voice still thick with emotion. But Victoria, look at her. Really look. She has Catherine's eyes. The birthmark. Even the way she moves. DNA can be manipulated. But Victoria's protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. The second test, conducted 2 days later at a facility Victoria personally selected, came back with identical results. 99.7%. Meredith Clark was Emma Whitmore, missing for 32 years and finally found. Marcus went into motion with the focused intensity of a man making up for lost time. He set up trust funds, arranged for private tutors if she wanted to finish her education, offered her a position learning the family business. He showed her photographs of Catherine, hundreds of them, carefully preserved in albums he'd kept hidden away because looking at them hurt too much. She would have loved who you became, he said softly, showing Meredith a picture of Catherine laughing in a garden. Strong, independent, a survivor. The media caught wind of the story within 48 hours. Billionaire's lost daughter found after 3 decades screamed the headlines. Reporters camped outside the estate gates. Meredith's photograph, pulled from some ancient DMV database, appeared on news sites alongside childhood pictures of baby Emma. The attention was overwhelming, suffocating. But for 2 perfect days, Meredith let herself believe in fairy tales. She walked through the Whitmore mansion as Emma, not as an intruder. She sat at family dinners where Marcus watched her with joy that seemed to radiate from him like light. She tried on the life she should have had, the family she should have known. Mrs. Chen hugged her in the kitchen when no one was watching. I knew, the housekeeper whispered. The moment I saw you, I knew. Welcome home. Even Brandon seemed subdued, though he avoided her with barely disguised resentment. Victoria maintained her icy distance, but stopped openly challenging the DNA results. For 48 hours, Meredith lived the fairy tale. Then Victoria found the evidence that shattered it all. The call came during breakfast on the 3rd morning. Victoria burst into the dining room with her private investigator in tow, a sharp-eyed man named Davis who carried a briefcase like it contained nuclear codes. Marcus. Victoria's voice was deadly calm. We need to talk. Now. Privately. But Marcus shook his head, reaching for Meredith's hand. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Emma. Victoria's smile was cold and terrible. Very well, Mr. Davis, please present your findings. The investigator opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, pulling out documents and photographs that he spread across the breakfast table like a dealer showing a losing hand. Hospital records from St. Mary's, Philadelphia, July 1993. Davis began in a monotone that made the word sound even more damning. Infant girl, admitted with severe respiratory distress. Death certificate issued July 19th, 1 day after admission. Meredith's blood turned to ice. That can't be right. There's more. Victoria's eyes glittered with vindication. Show her the foster care records, Mr. Davis. More documents. Forms that showed Meredith Clark entering the Philadelphia foster system, not in July 1993, but in January 1998. forms with digital timestamps that showed they'd been modified recently, within the last 3 months. And finally, Victoria pulled out bank statements with Meredith's name at the top. 3 deposits, each for $50,000, made to your account over the past 6 weeks. Care to explain where a waitress making minimum wage acquired $150,000? The room spun. Meredith stared at the statements, at her own name printed in black and white, at transactions she'd never made to an account she didn't recognize. I've never seen. Of course you haven't. Victoria's voice dripped with false sympathy. Because you're a professional. You researched my brother, found his weakness, manufactured evidence, and played the role perfectly. The DNA test? Probably bribed someone at the laboratory. The resemblance? Good makeup and acting. The birthmark? Easily faked. That's not true. Meredith turned to Marcus, desperate. None of this is true, I swear. But Marcus was staring at the death certificate with an expression that looked like his heart was being ripped out all over again. His daughter, his real daughter, had died 32 years ago, had been dead this entire time while he searched and hoped and refused to let go. The death certificate sat on the table, like an accusation written in official ink. Davis pushed it closer to Marcus with one finger, the gesture almost gentle despite the devastation it carried. The attending physician's signature is verified. The investigator continued. Death occurred at 4:15 a.m. on July 19, 1993. Cause: respiratory failure secondary to pneumonia. The body was released to Catherine Whitmore 2 days later for private burial. Meredith watched Marcus's face crumble, watched 32 years of hope die in real time. The burial, Marcus whispered. Catherine never told me about a burial. She was gone. With Emma. You thought she'd run to protect your daughter. Victoria's voice had lost its triumph, replaced by something almost sad. But the truth is simpler and crueler. Catherine lost Emma, couldn't bear to face you with that grief, and disappeared. And this, she gestured at Meredith with contempt. This opportunist saw a chance to exploit your pain. No, Meredith stood, so abruptly her chair fell backward. I didn't know any of this. I found a photograph. That's all. I never asked for money. Never claimed to be anyone. The bank statements say otherwise. Davis produced more documents. Wire transfers from an offshore account registered to a shell corporation. The same corporation that appears in several other fraud cases targeting wealthy families. You're not even the first time they've used this specific approach. The floor felt like it was dissolving beneath Meredith's feet. Someone had set her up. Someone had manufactured evidence so perfect, so detailed, that even she couldn't prove it was false. Brandon entered the dining room, and Meredith saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise, not shock, satisfaction quickly masked. He'd done this, planted the money, falsified the records, built the case against her, and she had no way to prove it. Marcus, please. Her voice broke. The DNA test was real. I didn't bribe anyone. I didn't fake anything. DNA tests can be contaminated. Davis's tone remained clinical, detached. Or the sample could have been switched before processing. It's more common than people think, especially when money's involved. Marcus looked at her with eyes full of agony and doubt. The man who'd embraced her 3 days ago now studied her like a stranger, like a threat. Did Catherine really give you that locket? His voice was barely audible. Or did you steal it from this house? The question felt like a knife between her ribs. Mrs. Chen gave it to me. She found it in the attic. Convenient. Victoria turned her attention to the doorway, where Mrs. Chen had appeared, drawn by the raised voices. Tell me, Mrs. Chen, did you perhaps help our guest access areas of this house she shouldn't have been in? Did you provide her with family heirlooms to make her story more believable? The housekeeper's face went pale. I would never. You were seen in the attic 3 weeks ago moving boxes. Brandon's voice was smooth, helpful even, like he was genuinely trying to solve a mystery. Security cameras show you removing items and bringing them to the kitchen. Items that you then gave to Meredith during her visits. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened with understanding and horror. Those were old linens I was washing. I never took. Save it. Victoria's voice cut like scissors through fabric. You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out within the hour. No. Meredith moved toward Mrs. Chun, but Marcus caught her arm. Don't. His voice was hollow, defeated. Please, just don't. The man who'd called her Emma, who'd shown her photographs of her mother, who'd cried with joy at finding her, now looked at her like she was poison. I want you out of this house, he said quietly. I want you to take whatever payment you negotiated for this performance and disappear. And if you ever contact me again, if you ever try to claim any connection to my family, I will use every resource I have to destroy you. Do you understand? Tears streamed down Meredith's face. I'm not lying. I didn't do any of this. The evidence says otherwise. Victoria gestured to security guards who'd materialized in the doorway. Please escort Ms. Clark from the premises. Ensure she takes nothing that doesn't belong to her. The walk to the front door felt like a death march. Camera flashes exploded as she stepped outside. Reporters who'd been waiting for the fairy tale continuation now got something better. The fraud exposed. The con artist caught. Ms. Clark, did you target Marcus Whitmore specifically? How much did you steal from the family? Is it true you bribed laboratory technicians? Meredith pushed through the crowd with her head down, their questions hitting like physical blows. She made it to her car, her ancient, rusted sedan that looked even more pathetic parked among the media vans and luxury vehicles. As she fumbled with her keys, Mrs. Chun appeared beside her, moving quickly despite her age. The housekeeper pressed something into Meredith's hand, a piece of paper folded small and tight. The truth isn't in the mansion, Mrs. Chun whispered urgently. It's with the woman who saved you. This address. Go there. And don't give up, child. Don't let them win. Security guards were already moving toward them. Mrs. Chun disappeared into the crowd before they could reach her, and Meredith climbed into her car with shaking hands. The paper was warm from Mrs. Chun's palm, an address in Philadelphia, written in precise handwriting, and beneath it a name, Patricia Moreno. Meredith was escorted from the estate in humiliation, but Mrs. Chun had given her one final gift, an address in Philadelphia, and a warning. The truth isn't in the mansion. It's with the woman who saved you. The media found Meredith's apartment within hours. Reporters camped in the hallway, knocked on her door at all hours, shouted questions through the thin walls. Her landlord called that evening with an eviction notice. Bad publicity, he said, like she'd chosen to become the villain in a story she didn't write. Rosie's Diner fired her the next morning. Not even a phone call, just a text message. Due to recent events and negative attention, we're terminating your employment effective immediately. She sat on her unmade bed in the studio apartment that had never felt like home, surrounded by the wreckage of a life that had always been fragile and now lay completely shattered. The fairy tale had lasted exactly 48 hours before transforming into a nightmare. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Most were reporters. Some were threats from people who decided she was guilty based on headlines alone. A few were offers to sell her story, to do interviews, to capitalize on the scandal. She blocked them all and stared at the paper Mrs. Chun had given her. Patricia Moreno, an address in Philadelphia's Fishtown neighborhood. No other context, no explanation. Just a name and location that was supposed to somehow contain truth. Meredith almost threw it away, almost accepted that she'd been beaten by people with more power, more money, more ability to shape reality into whatever version served them best. She was nobody, a waitress with no family and no resources. What chance did she have against the Whitmores? But something stopped her hand. Maybe it was stubborn pride. Maybe it was the memory of Marcus's face when he'd called her Emma, before doubt poisoned everything. Maybe it was just that she'd spent 28 years not knowing where she came from, and the brief taste of answers had been too intoxicating to abandon completely. Would you walk away from your own identity? Or would you fight even when the whole world says you're wrong? Comment below. She looked at her bank account. The real one, not whatever fabricated version Brandon had created. $347. Enough for gas to Philadelphia and maybe a meal. Not enough for anything resembling a future. The photograph, the torn half she'd found under table 7, sat on her nightstand. She'd kept it despite everything, despite being accused of theft and fraud and elaborate conspiracy. The woman in the image stared out at nothing, frozen in a moment 32 years gone. Catherine Whitmore, who'd allegedly lost her daughter and disappeared rather than face that grief. Except Mrs. Chen's locket suggested a different story. The hospital bracelet, the timing, the way the housekeeper had looked at Meredith with recognition that seemed to come from someplace deeper than coincidence. Two versions of history, one supported by official documents and investigation reports and the weight of institutional authority, the other existing only in fragments and whispers and the desperate hope of people who'd already been dismissed as unreliable. Meredith had spent her whole life being dismissed by foster parents who saw her as a temporary burden, by a system that processed her like paperwork, by a world that treated people without family or money as fundamentally disposable. She was tired of being erased. The decision crystallized slowly, like ice forming across a window. She couldn't fight the Whitmores directly, couldn't afford lawyers or investigators or the kind of resources that would let her challenge evidence that had been professionally fabricated. But she could follow the thread Mrs. Chun had given her, could find Patricia Moreno and ask questions that might lead to answers no one wanted her to find. She packed a bag with 3 days of clothes, emptied her apartment of anything valuable enough to pawn, and left the key on the landlord's desk with a note saying he could keep the security deposit. There was nothing worth coming back to anyway. The drive to Philadelphia took 90 minutes through early morning traffic. Meredith didn't listen to music, didn't turn on the radio to hear more news stories dissecting her character. She drove in silence, watching the sun rise over highways she'd traveled before without ever knowing they might lead to truth. The address Mrs. Chun had given her led to a modest row house in a neighborhood that had seen better decades but maintained a stubborn dignity. Flower boxes in the windows, a door painted cheerful yellow despite the peeling edges. She had nothing left to lose, so she drove to Philadelphia, to an address that would unlock 32 years of lies. Meredith knocked 3 times before the door opened. The woman who appeared was in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen enough suffering to recognize it in others. She wore scrubs despite clearly being home, like they'd become a second skin after decades of medicine. Patricia Moreno? Meredith's voice came out smaller than intended. The woman's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, shock, and finally something that looked like relief mixed with dread. Dear God, Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. You look just like her, just like Catherine. Mrs. Chun sent me. She said you could tell me the truth about what happened in 1993. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. She glanced up and down the street, then pulled Meredith inside quickly, closing the door like she was shutting out ghosts. The house smelled of coffee and lavender. Photographs lined the walls. Children, grandchildren. A life built on foundations of ordinary happiness. Patricia led Meredith to a small kitchen where morning light streamed through lace curtains. I've been waiting for this day for 32 years, Patricia said quietly, pouring coffee with shaking hands, praying for it and dreading it in equal measure. Sit down, child. This is going to be difficult to hear. Meredith sat, her heart hammering. Patricia took a long breath, like she was preparing to carry a weight she'd set down decades ago. I was working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital on July 17th, 1993. Emergency room. It was a slow night until about 2 a.m. when a woman stumbled through the doors, covered in blood. Patricia's voice took on the clinical tone of someone reciting trauma. She was holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. The woman was barely conscious, the baby was screaming, and she kept saying the same thing over and over. They're going to kill her. Please don't let them find her. The coffee cup trembled in Meredith's hands. Her name was Catherine Whitmore. She told me she'd been in a car accident, that someone had forced her off the road deliberately. Her car had gone down an embankment, and she'd crawled out with her daughter, hidden in the woods until she could get to a hospital. Patricia's eyes were distant, seeing that night play out again. She had internal bleeding, massive trauma. I knew immediately she wasn't going to make it, but she wasn't concerned about herself, only about the baby. What did she tell you? Meredith whispered that powerful people wanted them both dead, that she'd discovered something about her husband's family, embezzlement, criminal connections, things that would destroy reputations and send people to prison. She tried to gather evidence, tried to be smart about it. But someone found out. Patricia wiped her eyes. Catherine begged me to hide her daughter, to fake the intake records, to keep the baby off any official documentation, to make sure no one could trace her. Meredith felt tears streaming down her face. The death certificate was for a different infant who died that same night. A tragedy, a family in mourning, and Patricia's voice broke. I falsified records. I committed fraud. I took their dead child's paperwork and attached it to Catherine's name. And I took you. Because yes, child, it was you. And I placed you in the foster system under fabricated documentation. A foundling with no history, no connections. No way to trace back to the Whitmore family. The room spun, every piece clicking into place. The estimated birth date on her records. The gaps in her history. The way no one had ever been able to find information about her origins. Catherine lived for 2 more days, Patricia continued. She held on long enough to make me promise I'd keep you safe, to give me that locket as proof in case you ever came looking. She wrote a letter, sealed it, made me swear I'd only give it to you if you found me. Patricia's expression was anguished. And then she died, alone in a hospital bed, knowing her daughter was alive, but sacrificing any chance to watch you grow up. The bravest thing I've ever witnessed. Why didn't you go to the police? Meredith's voice was raw. Why didn't you tell anyone? Catherine made me promise not to. Said the people hunting her had connections everywhere. Police, politicians, judges. Said the only way to keep you alive was to make you disappear completely. Patricia reached across the table, gripping Meredith's hand. I've questioned that decision every single day for 32 years. Wondered if I did the right thing. But you're alive. You survived. And maybe that's all that matters. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decades. The Whitmores claim I'm a fraud, Meredith finally said. They have evidence, bank records, falsified documents, proof that I'm lying about everything. Patricia's expression hardened. Of course they do. Because someone in that family has spent 32 years covering up murder. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried. She stood, moving to a cabinet in the corner. Catherine knew they'd come after you, eventually, if you ever discovered the truth. She prepared for that possibility. She pulled out a box, old, weathered, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Patricia's hands trembled as she opened it, revealing an envelope with Meredith's birth name written in elegant script. Emma Catherine Whitmore. Your mother made me promise to give you this if you ever found me. Patricia handed over the envelope with reverence. But there's something else you need to know. Something Catherine discovered right before she ran. She wasn't running from Gerald Ashford. Patricia's eyes met Meredith's with an intensity that made her breath catch. She was running from family. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Victoria Whitmore, Marcus's sister, was Ashford's secret partner. They'd been embezzling from Whitmore Industries for years, building fortunes through shell companies and criminal connections. Catherine found the evidence, and Victoria ordered the hit. It wasn't some outside threat hunting them down. It was family. Meredith's hands shook as she held the envelope. Inside was her mother's voice, preserved across 3 decades. Inside were answers that people had killed to hide. There's more in that envelope than just a letter, Patricia said quietly. Catherine documented everything. Bank records, photographs, transaction histories. She knew she might die, so she made sure the truth could survive without her. Patricia handed Meredith a sealed envelope. Your mother made me promise to give you this if you ever found me. But there's something else you need to know. She wasn't running from Gerald Ashford. She was running from family. Meredith's hands trembled so violently she could barely break the seal on the envelope. Patricia gave her space, busying herself at the kitchen counter, while Meredith unfolded pages that had waited 32 years to be read. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, written with a pen that had pressed deeply into paper, like the writer had known these might be her final words and wanted them to last. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive. It means you grew up without me, without your father, without knowing where you came from or why. That breaks my heart more than the knowledge that I'm dying. My name is Catherine Whitmore. I am your mother, and I love you more than life itself, a statement that's not metaphorical, Because I'm giving my life to keep you safe. Meredith's vision blurred with tears. She wiped them away, desperate to keep reading. I need you to understand what happened, not just for your own sake, but because the truth is dangerous. The people who tried to kill us are powerful, connected, and utterly without conscience. And their family, your father's sister, Victoria, has been stealing from Whitmore Industries for 8 years. She partnered with Gerald Ashford, your father's business associate, to create an elaborate network of shell corporations and fraudulent accounts. Together, they've embezzled over $50 million. I discovered the evidence by accident. I was helping your father prepare for a board meeting when I found discrepancies in the financial reports. Payments to companies that didn't exist. Transfers to offshore accounts with no documentation. I thought it was a mistake at first. Then I realized it was systematic, intentional, theft on a massive scale. The letter continued with devastating detail. Catherine had investigated quietly, photographing documents, tracing money trails, building an irrefutable case. She'd planned to go to the authorities, to expose the corruption and protect Marcus's company. But Victoria found out I knew. I don't know how. Maybe she had the house monitored. Maybe someone saw me copying files. But 3 days after I compiled the evidence, her husband approached me in the driveway. Robert, Victoria's husband, your uncle by marriage, told me I had 2 choices. I could forget everything I'd learned and accept a generous payment for my silence. Or I could have an unfortunate accident. He didn't even try to hide the threat. He said it with a smile, like he was offering me a business proposal instead of my life. Meredith's stomach twisted. Brandon's father, the man, had threatened her mother, and now his son was continuing the family tradition. I told your father that night. Marcus wanted to go to the police immediately, but I was terrified. Robert had implied they had people everywhere, officers on their payroll, judges who owed them favors, connections that reached into every level of law enforcement. I didn't know who to trust, so I made copies of everything, hid the evidence in multiple locations, and I planned to run, not forever, just long enough to get the proof into the right hands. Hands that couldn't be bought or intimidated, but they didn't wait. 2 days later, Robert followed me when I was driving with you. He forced my car off the road on a stretch of highway with no witnesses. The crash should have killed us both. It would have if the car had rolled completely, but it stopped partway down the embankment, and I managed to get you out. The handwriting grew shakier here, like Catherine had been in pain while writing. I'm in a hospital now, hiding under a nurse's care. Patricia Moreno is risking everything to protect you, to keep you hidden while I arrange for the evidence to be delivered to people who can't be corrupted. But I can feel myself failing. Internal injuries. Bleeding that can't stop without surgery I can't risk because Victoria would find me. So I'm writing this as a backup plan, as insurance. Emma, my darling girl, I'm so sorry you won't remember me. Sorry I couldn't watch you grow, couldn't teach you to read or comfort you after nightmares or tell you how extraordinary you are. But I need you to live more than I need to be part of your life. And the only way to ensure that is to make you disappear. Patricia will hide you in foster care with false records. You'll grow up thinking you have no family, no history. That loneliness is my gift to you. It's survival. The letter detailed the evidence Catherine had compiled. Bank statements showing regular transfers from Whitmore Industries to shell corporations registered in Victoria's maiden name. Photographs of documents signed by both Victoria and Ashford. Transaction records proving systematic theft over years. Everything is in this envelope. Take it to the FBI, to journalists, to anyone with the power to expose corruption. But be careful, Emma. These people have protected their secrets for 3 decades. They'll try to discredit you, destroy you, make the world believe you're the criminal instead of the victim. Trust your father. Marcus is a good man who loved me deeply. He'll want to believe you, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Victoria will manufacture proof of your guilt. She's had years to perfect the art of deception. But your father's heart knows the truth, even if his mind doubts. I love you, my precious girl. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. But you're alive, and that's all that matters. Survive, and when you're strong enough, fight back. Forever your mother, Catherine. Meredith looked up with tears streaming down her face to find Patricia crying too. Between the pages were photographs, clear images of bank documents, notarized signatures, transaction histories that painted an undeniable picture of theft and conspiracy. Victoria Whitmore had been stealing from her own brother for years, and when threatened with exposure, she'd ordered murder. Meredith had the truth, but Victoria had the power, the lawyers, and 32 years of covering her tracks. Walking into that mansion again could be the last thing she ever did. Meredith returned to the Whitmore estate 3 days later. This time she didn't come alone. Patricia sat beside her in the passenger seat, and in her bag were 32 years of carefully preserved evidence. The guards at the gate tried to turn them away, but Meredith had called ahead, not to Victoria, but to Marcus's personal attorney. "We have evidence related to Catherine Whitmore's death," she told him. "Evidence that proves murder, embezzlement, and conspiracy. If Marcus wants the truth about what happened to his wife, he'll see us." The attorney had arranged a meeting in the estate's formal library, with Marcus present along with his legal team. What he hadn't expected was Victoria to show up, flanked by her own lawyers, and wearing an expression of supreme confidence. "This is harassment," Victoria announced before anyone else could speak. "We have a restraining order being filed." "Sit down, Victoria." Marcus's voice was exhausted but firm. "Let's hear what they have to say." Meredith placed the envelope on the table between them. Her hands were steady now, fueled by righteous purpose. "This is a letter from Catherine Whitmore, written 2 days before she died, along with documented evidence of embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted murder." She watched Victoria's face carefully, saw the micro-expression of fear before it was locked down behind steel composure. "My client won't dignify these fabricated accusations," Victoria's attorney began, but Marcus held up a hand. "Let me see it." Meredith spread the documents across the table. Bank statements showing regular transfers to shell corporations, photographs of signed documents, transaction records that painted an irrefutable picture, and Catherine's letter, her elegant handwriting preserved across 3 decades, detailing exactly how Victoria and her late husband had tried to kill her. Marcus read in silence, his face going progressively paler. When he looked up at his sister, the betrayal in his eyes was devastating. "Is this true?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. "Marcus, you can't possibly believe this is clearly fabricated. The bank records are real." Patricia's voice was quiet but firm. "I witnessed Catherine collecting this evidence. I watched her die from injuries sustained when Robert forced her car off the road. And I've kept these documents hidden for 32 years, waiting for the day when Emma would be strong enough to fight back." Brandon lunged for the documents suddenly, trying to gather them up, to destroy evidence that would send his family to prison. But Mrs. Chin appeared from the doorway. She'd been waiting, watching, and her phone was raised, recording everything. "I've been recording since they arrived," the housekeeper said calmly. "Every word, every attempt to suppress evidence. It's already uploaded to cloud storage, already sent to multiple recipients. You can't bury this anymore." Marcus called the police himself. When officers arrived 20 minutes later, Victoria and Brandon were arrested on charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Murder charges would follow once the full investigation was complete. Marcus watched his sister being led away in handcuffs, and the heartbreak on his face was almost too painful to witness. 6 months later, the world looked different. Victoria and Brandon both sat in federal prison, convicted on multiple counts after evidence proved overwhelming and undeniable. Gerald Ashford had been arrested in the Cayman Islands, fighting extradition. The Whitmore family name had been dragged through every news cycle, dissected and analyzed and used as a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal. But in quieter corners, away from media attention, healing had begun. Meredith stood beside Marcus at a cemetery in upstate New York, looking down at a headstone that read Catherine and Whitmore, beloved wife and mother. Fresh flowers, roses that Catherine had loved, rested against the marble. "She would have been so proud of you," Marcus said quietly. "Your courage, your strength. You're more like her than you know." They'd been building their relationship slowly, carefully. Father and daughter, learning each other over coffee and long conversations. Marcus had set up the trust fund again, but Meredith had insisted on earning her own way. She'd enrolled in design school, pursuing dreams She deferred for years while surviving. The torn photograph sat reunited and framed in Marcus's study now. Both halves finally together. The image complete after 3 decades apart. Later that week, Meredith visited Rosie's diner. Not as an employee this time, but as a customer. The new waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and determined shoulders, brought coffee without being asked. Meredith left a tip that was probably too generous, along with a note. Keep fighting. It gets better. Walking out into autumn sunlight, she thought about her mother's final words, about survival and truth and the courage to fight back against people who seemed untouchable. Family isn't just blood, it's truth. And sometimes the courage to fight for it costs everything, but gives back even more. Some stories don't end. They just begin again with better authors. Subscribe for more stories of hidden truths and second chances.